I want to welcome you to our annual lecture, The Church of Pope Francis, Theological and Practical Responses to Laudato Si, which is co-sponsored by the College of Arts and Sciences, the Departments of Theology and Biology, Environmental Science and Environmental Studies, and the Gale Office of Sustainability Initiatives. More than a decade ago, Dr. Erin Lothes visited St. Thomas while a doctoral student at Fordham for an event focused on the environment sponsored by the bishops. Since that time, she has worked as a fellow at the Earth Institute at Columbia University and is on the faculty at the College of St. Elizabeth in Morristown, New Jersey. Dr. Lothes organized a 3-year interest group at the Catholic Theological Society of America to focus on sustainability and discipleship, resulting in the article Catholic Moral Traditions and Energy Ethics for the 21st Century, which was published by the Journal of Moral Theology. Since the publication of Pope Francis's encyclical letter, Laudato Si, on care for our common home, she has been a sought-after speaker at universities and in faith communities, averaging about a talk a month. Her focus on faith communities and sustainability is evident in her recent book, Inspired Sustainability, which reflects her research with diverse American congregations inspired to care for the environment. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Erin Lothes.
Thank you very much, Professor Sinander. It's a great pleasure to be here at St. Thomas and to be welcomed by Professor Sinander's warm hospitality for these past 2 days. And I've enjoyed so many great conversations with 2 different student groups and a very rich faculty conversation, and just wonderful time walking around your beautiful campus. So it's been a real pleasure to be here. It's evident this is such a nice city. In addition to strolling past the Mississippi River, which was a great pleasure, as soon as I landed, I noticed in the airport that there was a baby grand piano there. And I come in from New York, and I have never seen a piano parked in any of the airports. So this is a wonderful place to be, and I'm so pleased to be here tonight. So I added a subtitle or a new title to this talk, which is Talking About a Revolution. And I'll allude to that. But I want to thank the Institute for Catholicism and Citizenship, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Departments of Theology, Biology, Environmental Sciences, and Environmental Studies, and the Gale Office of Sustainability Initiatives. Thank you very much for creating this time for conversation about an exciting, world-shaking document, Laudato Si. There's a picture of one publication of it. Here's my copy. It's a great, great document, and it came out in a stellar year, 2015. What a year. We had this first of its kind encyclical that brought concern for the earth and concern for the poor front and center, a theme present in magisterial teaching but never before heralded in one document focusing on all of these relationships. Pope Francis visiting the United States Congress, Pope Francis visiting the UN, the ratification of the new sustainability goals, and the Paris Climate Treaty. So this was an incredible year, and Laudato Si energized global conversations in amazing ways. So many themes are evident here. If there's 2 ideas I hope you come away with, it would be these. First of all, that energy decisions are ethical decisions, and that we need to communicate climate solutions. So let me talk about what Laudato Si has been. And in this idea of talking about a revolution, Pope Francis writes that we need a bold cultural revolution. And in each of these terms, each of these words is important: bold cultural revolution. What comes to mind when I say revolution? Newness, radical change, upheaval. Revolution, differently from war, suggests new frontiers, a race to victory, and the confidence of a better society to come. Revolution can be good, in other words. The Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, the Digital Revolution beckon with excitement, while the frightening and maybe unwinnable wars on drugs, war on terror, war on cancer, war on poverty, these wars seem to drag on. A narrative of revolution galvanizes society towards great achievements like the space age revolution and the accomplishment of landing on the moon. So these positive valences of revolution can coexist with the reality of upheaval and the unexpected. Revolution conveys urgency and dramatic change through struggle, but importantly, it is a metaphor that Americans often embrace as part of our founding narrative, the American Revolution. Revolution suggests societies that have accomplished unthinkable goals, and there is no doubt that we are currently in the midst of an energy revolution. So how does Francis talk about a revolution? Well, he says it's a bold cultural revolution, but what's so interesting about paragraph 114 is the purpose of the revolution is to recover the values and the great goals, swept away by our unrestrained delusions of grandeur. And he's talking about far more than shifting technologies. The bold cultural revolution begins with acknowledging today's dominating mindset, what he calls a technocratic paradigm. And this is fundamentally a spiritual crisis. It's one that calls for an ecological and religious conversion. Paradoxically, the revolution is about recovering values. It is actually a conservative renewal, or a renewal for the sake of conserving not only conservation of the earth, but our Christian vocation as persons of faith before God, among our neighbors, and as leaven in society, building the common good, as I see everywhere proclaimed here at St. Thomas. The ecological conversion at its core is about our creedal affirmation of God, the Father, the Almighty, the creator of heaven and earth, creator of an abundant earth whose gifts are meant for the blessing of all. So why is this revolution underway? Why is it needed? So here are these same images, shifted a little bit. And I've moved the image of Syria from the side front and center. For a moment, let's consider the crisis in terms of war instead of revolution. And in February of 2015, writing in Harper's Magazine, Rebecca Solnit described the devastation to be anticipated from climate change, quote, if we don't leave the age of petroleum behind, evoking the catastrophic scenes in London, Dresden, Naples, and Hiroshima. And we can think of images of Syria today, recognizing not a single one-factor causality, but what the military calls a threat multiplier in the drought, in the multiple stresses upon the region. Observing society's entrenched dependence on fossil fuels, she concludes that the world is still in a wartime economy, only now the war is against nature. The rhetoric of war is also employed by the groups committed to fossil fuels' ongoing assault. Solnit cites a political consultant who strategically advised a group of oil and gas executives to, quote, think of this as an endless war. Solnit warns that it's not endless, though. The war will end, soon in victory or later in defeat. This war metaphor is ambivalent. While the call to arms is a stirring rallying cry that might seem to motivate widespread social support for climate action, the war narrative is in fact deeply ambivalent. Can all agree we are at war? And if so, with whom? Who are the combatants, belligerents, bystanders, and allies? Should all consumers of fossil fuels be considered aggressors, or only those profiting from its production or funding misinformation? US consumers are almost universally complicit by our disproportionate use of fossil fuels, yet most Americans view this as necessary consumption, as legitimate fuel for the decent work of building a life for their families, contributing to economic growth, and participating in the American dream. They are not intentionally harming the environment and bristle at the suggestion by carbon Calvinists that their consumption is a sin to be indicted by the new secular faith in environmentalism. And I agree. There is nothing more irritating than a green moral zealot, right? And so the war metaphor is risky. The framing The framing of climate change as a battle in the larger, broader culture wars has been devastating. Environmental issues have been tarred with the brush of liberal politics and bicoastal elitism, associated with white urbanites lamenting for polar bears but disregarding minority communities disproportionately burdened with environmental toxins, and dismissed as besotted with dreams of abundant renewable energy that are perceived to be impossibly costly. These antagonizing frames have imprisoned the climate change conversation, isolating it from the values with which Americans broadly identify, values like freedom, self-reliance, and pragmatism. For people of faith, the frame is conversion, not war. None of us is trying to kill the earth. This is very important to say. Though I am a Catholic, I am not about guilt, and we should not feel guilty for climate change. Yet we must talk about reality and responsibility, and thus our faith response to the problems we face today. For Catholics, climate change is an issue of faith, and one Pope Francis has raised to the international stage, with Laudato Si as the document of the year in this historic events of 2015. Francis has talked, and people have listened, because of his compassion, his humility, and his honesty, his faith in action. And Francis has asked us to talk about the revolution. So some of you of a certain generation may remember this song. This is Tracy Chapman, if you don't recognize it.
Don't you know, talking about a revolution, it sounds like a whisper. Don't you know, talking about a revolution, it sounds like a whisper. Wow.
Okay, so she's saying that talking about the revolution, it sounds like a whisper. And talking about climate change often sounds like a whisper. It sounds like a bad word or a scary idea or something that we're not empowered, or maybe it's not even polite to talk about it. Many of us are unfamiliar with the science. We're unsure if we're feeling the effects of climate change or if we're affecting others. And we're uncomfortable with any sense of guilt. But the church is now talking about climate change very clearly, and we can join in that conversation, not in a whisper, but confidently as an expression of our faith. And there is good news. There are solutions to the climate crisis. Pope Francis is the clearest messenger of the Catholic social teaching tradition regarding climate change and poverty and inequality today. This message expresses the church's ancient concern for the poor and vulnerable. So while climate change may seem like a distant whisper, around the world it is hitting people like a bolt of lightning. So I want to share this trailer from an excellent film called Sun Come Up.
Solwara emi mama belum ipla em salukoti mipla. Tu solwara ko plong bagarap island do mi plato. Sem yemino lap sabe hamasya behind island by sink. Namu pla people bloka treci boklo train pain im haplong go stop.
Harim Rosem lo yupla lo katres, you are easygoing people lo here and minara prakain orgeta.
Only ami planitim relocation because lo solwara ami go antapa change lo climate na. We just have to accept these people. They are our brothers.
At the rate emi woklong gono island woklong sink and by island sing pass or all man by die pass lo hangire.
Money all man by die pass lo hangire.
I don't want this to happen to my people.
If we come here, we will not be the cartridge people anymore.
Most of our culture will have to live in memory.
If everybody moves, I think I'll be the last man to put my feet on the island before moving away.
So I first came to St. Thomas for a scholars conference hosted by the United States bishops focusing on climate change. And there was another scholars conference in 2013, and the bishop from Papua New Guinea, who was involved in this dialogue between the Carterets Islanders and the people and Bougainville, where they were moving, was present at that conference. So we heard from him. There's also bishops from Florida and a bishop from Alaska, who was currently, at that time, resettling several towns because the softening of the earth and the climate changing. So climate refugees are a present reality. And what we know are major impacts of climate change include drought, flooding, and warmer days. The evidence for the human influence on climate change has grown since the 4th assessment report of the IPCC, the international gathering of scientists from around the world, who state in the 5th assessment report, it is extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. And the global temperature has warmed by 0.9 degrees Celsius at this point. So how is climate change affecting our lives? The World Meteorological Organization reports that 15 of the 15 hottest years on record have been in the 21st century. So the last 15 years have been the hottest 15 years, and as I said, global temperatures have already risen. When we think of impacts we've already seen in the United States, these two on the left are images from Katrina, and on the right, this is a picture from Shishmaref, Alaska, where people are resettling their villages elsewhere. What's happening around the world? Well, we know that impacts will include hunger and climate refugees, such as the people in the Carterets Island, and scientists estimate that the numbers of climate refugees may range from 50 to 150, maybe 200 million climate refugees by 2050. This is a graph that shows the worldwide number of refugees since the Second World War, and we've got 4 million already from Syria. And this graph shows where they've gone. And as a percentage of population, Lebanon has absorbed 10 to 20% of its own population size of Syrian refugees, an extraordinary number. Can you imagine if, say, 15% of the United States population, if that number of Syrian refugees arrived here? So this is the face of climate change that we can expect. I know you recently had an excellent colloquium discussing the plight of refugees, and Professor Kristen Heyer's work on an ethic of kinship and hospitality is going to be such an important theological and faith response to bring forward. So in a nutshell, how are we contributing to climate change? Well, we all know we have a climate footprint. This illustrates the sources of the greenhouse gases in basic household life. So the Catholic Climate Covenant turns this into an interesting message by asking, who's under your climate footprint? How are we contributing to climate change, and what is the impact? And so I see in this a new form of globalization. We've heard that the world is flat, right? That our world is full of social globalization, political globalization, cultural globalization, but there's also moral globalization, signifying the global moral impact of our actions. And this calls for a global ethics. For Pope Francis, this globalization of moral impact signifies what he calls the one complex crisis. It's not an environmental crisis, it's an environmental social crisis. And his cultural critique is equally complex and comprehensive. And he calls us to broaden our vision and use our freedom to create the lives and the communities that we truly want, that are best for ourselves and for the future. So one of the key themes, one of the key words from the encyclical is integral ecology. And with this, he expresses the broader vision, which includes God's way of looking on the world, in which all living beings have a value of their own. And he writes, by their mere existence, they bless him and give him glory, citing the Psalms. And he points to these three levels of relationship in integral ecology: our relationship with God, our neighbor, and with the earth, directed towards the common good. This is defined as the sum of those conditions of social life that affect all individuals and groups and allow individuals and groups to find their own fulfillment. So our own well-being is linked with others. Things can't be good for us all by ourselves. We share most of the good things: peace, air, water, agricultural systems. Common things must be shared. And sometimes that requires prioritizing how they are shared and in what ways. So when he speaks of one complex crisis that is both ecological and social, he's bringing up critiques of global development, ways that people suffer from economic exclusion in an economy that kills. Interesting exemplification of this in a recent article by the New York Times that showed that at different income levels, about 60 years ago, people would live about 2 years longer than each other at higher income levels. Now it's 14 years longer if you have that same income disparity. He's criticizing the globalization of indifference, an obsession with maximizing profit, and the technocratic paradigm, this interesting term. He's criticizing a deified market. Again, he's criticizing excess, not the goodness of these social and economic systems, which are essential to our healthy economic life, but the excess of a deified market, claiming that the market can create integral and sustainable development all by itself. He's concerned about the ways we have an economy of exclusion, deaf to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. So Pope Francis stresses that working for just distribution of the goods of the earth is a moral obligation, and for Christians, it's a commandment. It's giving to the poor and to peoples what is due by right. This is the theme of the universal destination of goods. So he writes, interestingly, economies should have meaning. Just because something is new, it's a development, doesn't mean it's a positive technological development. And I love this idea that economies should have meaning. We think of art or films or relationships as having meaning, but he wants us to think of how our economies can have meaning. A narrow focus on profit, not profit itself, but a narrow and exclusive concern for profit has risks. It can ignore the consequences of pollution. Finance can overwhelm the real economy. We've seen the crisis of financialization of the economy to an excessive degree. The externalization of costs, where the costs of pollution that are real are simply not reflected in the price of a product, but externalized into the healthcare budget or into the emergency management cleanup budget, right? The costs are real, it's just where have they gone? And his great concern is that the poor are excluded from the benefits of the economy. This is a picture from a pesticide training manual. One of my focus groups was conducted amidst migrant workers in Eastern Washington, and the National Catholic Rural Life Council had worked with them to develop this pesticide awareness and let them know that they did not need to remain in the fields when they were being sprayed, and looked at the possible consequences of this pollution. And so there's excess pollution beyond what our bodies, the earth, the oceans can absorb. So Pope Francis is rejecting what he calls a practical and a cultural relativism. A practical relativism is when convenience and individual needs trump all other considerations. And cultural relativism is when values are no longer guiding the main decisions. And he lists these terrible things that happen: trafficking, exploitation, pollution, experimentation, drugs, and organ selling. So he is calling for a cultural revolution that rises beyond these relativisms in which our values are pushed aside and are not guiding communities. It's a cultural and a spiritual revolution, not simply a technical improvement in our energy systems. So when he talks about the natural moral structures of our lives, I think this is a beautiful quote. It's one of my favorites. We are also God's gift to ourselves, and we must respect our natural and moral structures. When he speaks about the technocratic paradigm that controls too much, we're recognizing that technology can have unexpected risks. Many technologies are wonderful and have made great progress for civilization. Our civilization is based upon what fossil fuels have accomplished. But Pope Francis is asking us to question if these progressions, if these new technologies are always good, if they're automatically a good thing. And he wants us to choose the use of our technology to direct our economies to have meaning and to use our freedom to do so. So these two pictures are of a fracking well and some water from a tap nearby. And this is mountaintop removal to access coal, and an interesting graph of the correlation between mining sites and poverty in Appalachia. So this is where we can see that connection between the environmental and the social and economic inequality. This inequity, he writes, affects not only individuals, but entire nations. And so the climate, energy, poverty nexus is really important. And a great scholar, Professor Ramanathan, who is on the Institute of the Scripps Oceanography Institute and also a member of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, interprets the whole planet in two worlds, divided by energy poverty. There's the top 4 billion with unlimited access to energy, and the bottom 3 billion with limited access to energy. Even within the United States, clearly within the top 4 billion, there are many suffering energy poverty, spending 10% or more of their income on energy. Internationally, energy poverty is often lethal. There are 4 million deaths annually from smoke-filled kitchens, people cooking with biomass, forest products, et cetera, inside their homes. And the leading killer of women and children in developing nations includes childbirth deaths, often where there aren't birthing centers with adequate lighting, trying to give birth at night, et cetera. 290 million women die annually in this. So energy poverty internationally is an enormous problem. What Professor Ramanathan says is we need to dial down two types of emissions. In the wealthy world, the top 4 billion, we need to dial down luxury emissions. Right? And in the developing world, we need to dial down livelihood emissions and create alternatives to these soot pollutants, methane, ozone, the climate pollutants that are generated by these practices in the developing world. So, to take a closer look at what energy poverty looks like in India, 13 of the world's most polluted cities are in India. Indoor smoke kills 500,000 women and children annually. And worse, people are threatening to deforest large areas to access the coal reserves underground. However, a really interesting article, also by The Economist, has analyzed the way the solution to India's economic problems is the same as the solution to its environmental problems. That India needs energy access. It has a failing grid where even if there are plugs in the wall, that does not mean there is energy. And so they need energy access. And distributed energy sources like local microgrid, solar or wind is a solution to the energy access problem. This also creates domestic renewable energy and creates energy security. It prevents the need to buy expensive and unreliable energy elsewhere. It creates jobs in factories with reliable power. It reduces the deforestation and can address the problem of currently subsidized aquifer pumping in India. So it's a really interesting analysis that the solution to India's economic problems and its jobs problems is the same as its environmental solution. So to continue to provide employment, it's imperative to develop these kinds of economies which favor productive diversity and energy access and business creativity. And Pope Francis emphasizes that business is a noble vocation, especially if it contributes to the common good by creating jobs. Yet, as we look at this question of energy poverty, he points to the tragedy of ecological debt. There's many ways this happens. It occurs with the extraction of resources and raw materials and energy sources in polluting ways. This often leads to conflict, disrupts the economy. Many economies never develop because of what's called the resource curse. So often toxic garbage is shipped back to these countries. And then the great tragedy of climate inequity is the way that overconsumers have dominated the climate sink. They have polluted with their own emissions in the course of the progress of the developing nations, leaving very little in the carbon budget for the necessary and just development of the developing world. So here we see climate change's unequal impact pictorially. And what this graph does is distort the land size to represent the statistics. The top shows those nations that have historically contributed the most to climate change. So the United States has contributed about 24% of all greenhouse gas emissions since the Industrial Revolution. So it's oversized. The nations that have received the impacts of climate change are largely the global south, Africa, Asia. Very few impacts evident in the United States, right? And so malaria, malnutrition, water-based diseases, flood fatalities, heat and drought, these are primarily experienced in the global south. So to that, Pope Francis issues a theological protest, reminding us that the rich and poor have equal dignity. The spirit of life dwells in every living creature, and God as creator wills the well-being and flourishing of all. And we are called to share in God's creativity and to participate in the ongoing development of creation. And in a theological view of Christian freedom, our freedom is oriented to God's future. Freedom is not arbitrary choice. It's a freedom to participate in the unfolding of God's creation. So to look at the pictures of St. Francis here, care of creation and care of neighbor combine in a new obligation, which is the obligation to talk about energy decisions as ethical decisions. So Catholic energy ethics looks at principles from Catholic moral theology to say what are the principles that can help us navigate the current energy realities, our current energy scene. What are the priorities and what are the sources? Recent sources, of course, Laudato Si. Energy, Justice, and Peace. I have this book. I'm going to pull it out. This is a text from the Vatican, from the Pontifical Council of Justice and Peace. It's called Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. This is Energy, Justice, and Peace, a reflection on energy in the current context of development and environmental protection. It's an entire text on energy written by the Vatican, and it contains a lot of the research and references that go before the analysis in Laudato Si. Then there are two fascinating documents. I had the opportunity to share these with the Theology Club yesterday. Appeals from the global bishops that are letters sent to the Lima Climate Conference in 2014, and then another appeal from the global bishops to the world's leaders gathered at Paris. And those are great, really interesting sources for Catholic environmental energy ethics. But it all originates in what Pope John Paul said 25 years ago. Today, the environmental crisis has reached such proportions as to be the moral responsibility of everyone. So for this reason, we need to start thinking about energy decisions as ethical decisions. What are the principles that we can build on? Well, in 1981, the US bishops wrote an interesting paper on energy ethics. And they proposed 6 principles. They are the protection of life, the responsibility, and we, in this paper that Dr. Sinander mentioned, looked at our responsibility to recognize the impacts we've had on the earth, working for the common good, assuring distributive justice, working for energy access to the poor, insisting on participation and transparency, that all can participate in decisions about their own energy and their own communities. And then we added this principle of technological prudence, being aware of the potential risks of technology. So all these principles are directed to building the common good. And how do we move forward? Well, this is a summary of some of the statements of that Lima document signed by the US bishops. This is a fascinating document because this is the first place where I saw a call to keep the temperature increase, not just at 2 degrees Celsius, which is what most scientists and policy people have used as our benchmark, but to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So it's a radical recognition of what we should aim for to protect the planet in order to protect those communities suffering the worst impacts of climate change, exactly like the Carteret Islanders, and to end the fossil fuel era. They issued a call for a move to 100% renewables. This is a complicated slide, but it's the one that really got me thinking about the need for renewable energy at a massive scale. It represents multiple models of where our energy might be coming from in the 21st century, what different sources of energy might represent the global mix. And different groups of scientists created different models, different assumptions, and all came out with their own predictions. But on these 2 on the right, these models were framed as having a 70% chance of hitting that 2% target. Those on the left don't even aim for that. And in order to do that, we need to have 50 to 75% renewable energy. A huge increase in the amount of energy, of renewable energy. That's to have a 70% chance of hitting the 2 degrees target. If you felt you had a 70% chance of getting home safely tonight in your car, would you maybe choose a different way of getting home? I would like to, and so this really made me start thinking about how important it is to radically ramp up our scale, our deployment of renewable energy. This conclusion is shared by the world's economic leaders. This is a picture of the G7. And last June, they also said we need complete decarbonization by the end of the century. So the G7 and the world's global bishops are on agreement on this point. Interesting partners. So where are we currently? Well, 2011, renewable energy was 9% of the US mix. 2014, a little bit higher. So we have a lot of increase to build in. How much? Well, as that previous slide said, 50 to 75% by 2010 to have that 70% chance. A slightly closer measure that's a little easier to wrap our minds around, 42% renewable energy by 2030. Okay. So what are the priorities as the conclusions from our paper on Catholic energy ethics? Well, we need to end coal, oil, shale gas, and tar sands. The carbon output from these energy sources does not fit within a global carbon budget. We need to use natural gas carefully as a bridge fuel with an endpoint. Scientists and engineers are examining new models of renewable energy. They may play a role. One can never know what technologies may develop. Absolutely end subsidies for fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are subsidized at a rate 6 times the amount of subsidies for renewable energy globally. This is data from the International Monetary Fund. And invest in R&D for renewable technologies and systems. Right? If we want something, we need to pay for it. However, it's really important to note that the existing technologies already exist. We don't have to wait for someone to invent something. And as you know, Minnesota is investing in solar energy quite considerably. Here's the point that Laudato Si makes about this in paragraph 52. Developed countries ought to significantly limit their consumption of non-renewable energies to assist poorer countries. So the obligation of developed nations who are on the benefiting end of that ecological debt is to pay that debt by scaling up, developing these advanced, sophisticated, renewable technologies, seeing them commercialized, seeing their costs go down, and share those technologies with the developed world, which absolutely has a need in justice for its own energy, for its own development. Okay, there's some roadblocks in the way. Has anyone seen the clip that this is about? It's just for fun. This is a crazy new technology. We may never see this. This is a solar roadway. These are actually solar panels, very durable solar panels. You can drive an 18-wheeler on them. They have channels along the side. They will melt the snow. You don't have to plow. You don't have to shovel. The water drains away. You can change the lanes with LED lighting. If there's a moose up ahead, it will signal you down back so people can avoid those roadblocks. Who knows? Maybe this will take place. But some of the greater roadblocks that we face are themes that I gathered through my conversations with faith-based environmentalists. I conducted focus groups with 13 Christian groups, Jewish groups, Buddhist, Jain, Muslim, Navajo, all different faith traditions in the United States, faith-based environmentalists, to say, what is it that inspires you? And what are the barriers that you see in your own communities? And from these conversations, the first thing is a knowledge gap. If you don't understand that there's a problem, people reasonably don't act, right? So scientific literacy is really important. Understanding the facts about climate change is really important. This is not so much an issue for people between 18 and 24. This is the group that understands climate change the most. Next is the caring gap, when you know, but there are so many additional priorities and legitimate demands for our time. Finally, the action gap. I know, I care, but what am I going to do about it? So the knowledge gap includes the limitations of scientific literacy. It includes our cognitive limitations. We have inbuilt limits. We're evolutionarily driven to respond to a charging tiger. We're not programmed to react to something 35, 75, 100 years from now. That's just the way our brains are made. People have different interests, but then most importantly, there's the limit to knowledge that arises from willed moral ignorance, right? This is when we pull the wool over our eyes. It's easier just not to know sometimes. The caring gap, as my research participants told me, is based of consumerism, as you might think, a desire to keep in step with progress, anticipating Pope Francis's critique, the realities of being distracted or maybe just not interested. And what combats effective action? Well, being busy. We're all extremely busy. We're comfortable with many of the features of our lives that are supported by the current fossil fuel energy system. One or two participants even said, well, maybe I'm lazy. And being overwhelmed, this is really important. It's easy to get overwhelmed by the climate problem. And then simple habits. We're creatures of habit. So in response to this, I offer the notion of a spirituality of creative sacrifice. That sacrifice isn't a painful loss necessarily. It can be a choice that we make to reflect the relationships that matter to us, the things that make us who we are, recognizing that we're finite. None of us can do everything, so we have to prioritize that which we give our time and our attention to. And yet, as a church, we have collective impact. We have the inspiration of our moral traditions and of our life of prayer. And we have the knowledge that God is present, inspiring care for the world. And so I think the other side of this overwhelming world crisis is the potential for living in world friendship. We can transform our actions and our choices to things that build up a new community. So we have this power, our institutions have power. We need to insist on being fruitful in what we do. And that comes through persistence, relentlessly following through on the goals that you have for yourself and for your communities in this transition to a new renewable society. Recognizing that this is part of the search for the global common good. And we need to communicate climate solutions. This is what I mean about talking about a revolution. We need to talk about this and feel positive about the many positive solutions that already exist. There are already solutions for developing economies. So Professor Ramanathan talking about those bottom 3 billion who all they need to do is cook and have some light maybe for doing homework. They're not plugging in Game Boys and iPhones and lots of other things. They're doing their banking on their cell phone, right? So solar lamps and cook stoves exist, and I have one of these solar lamps. I got it as a fundraiser for the Lima conference. So you set this outside, you get a lamp, and then children can do their homework at night without doing it by the light of a choking, polluting stove that is shortening their lifespan. There are solar cook stoves that do the same and allow clean cooking for women and children. These exist. This light cost about $22, and Professor Ramanathan calculates that if every member of the developing world spent about $25, we could fund these solar stoves and solar lights for the 1.1 billion that have almost no access to energy. So that's a solution that can happen. There's a revolution in renewable energy in the United States. In fact, if you go to the Department of Energy's website, that's what they call it, the energy revolution. The cultural revolution, I was speaking with the class this morning and mentioned, we all know, many of us know, the really high carbon footprint of beef. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have to give it up altogether. There's a wonderful TED talk about being a weekend vegetarian. No, a weekday vegetarian. Did I get that right? Should be the other way around. Be a weekday vegetarian, and then on the weekend, go ahead and have a hamburger, right? So that it allows people to do better, but yet still maintain the things that are part of our culture, right? And walkable communities, very important part of the transition to a sustainable economy. So Bloomberg News, this is last year, reported that the race for renewable energy has passed a turning point. The world is now, last year, adding more capacity for renewable power each year than coal, natural gas, and oil combined. And earlier this spring, there was greater additions to the US energy source from solar energy than from natural gas. So this rapid acceleration of the deployment of renewable energy is happening, and we can participate in scaling it up, in ensuring that the policies are there to make it happen, and making our own choices. Many of us can choose renewable energy in our utilities, and then your whole home can be powered by renewable energy. Here's a graph put out in a report from Deutsche Bank that predicts that by 2017, solar energy will be at cost parity, cost the same or less as fossil fuel energy in 80% of the world. That's next year. And this graph compares the returns in an investment portfolio of a carbon-free portfolio with a portfolio that is invested in business as usual with probably 9 to 13% fossil fuel stocks. And they don't differ. The returns are the same in a divested or a non-divested portfolio over 18 years of data. If there's one silver bullet, it would be a price on carbon. This is the market mechanism that most economists agree is the best way to resolve the unfairness of some people polluting, some producers selling cheap products, and other people suffering the impacts, other people paying the costs of that pollution. This is the free rider problem. And an even price on carbon eliminates that inequality. It's a predictable mechanism, 7 of the world's largest fossil fuel companies have asked for an energy price. They would like to know what regulatory environment they're in, and it helps them predict their investments and so on. So it's a common commitment that will change people's behavior and possibly create revenue to further solve the climate problem. So as we face this climate problem, I see a number of evolving virtues. One, we have to handle the complexity. Yes, an answer may be like this in one part of the world and like this in something else. That isn't a reason to throw out a solution. We have to accept the complexity, recognize the diversity of ways things work out, and still move forward. It's important to be visible. We need to talk about our own revolutions, talk about our own actions, our own models, and not feel that we're being judgmental. To act locally, this is a way of inspiring our own commitment to what we're doing, but seek actions at scale. Find ways that your actions can tie in to larger scaled up and scaled sideways activities. Fundamentally, what Pope Francis is inviting us to do is experience an ecological conversion, to look at the earth as a source of gratitude. He says, the earth is not a problem to be solved. It's a source of gratitude and wonder, and that we need to know that God is present to the whole world, that Christ is blessing every single creature, and that we're grateful for God's creation and ourselves as part of it. So there's a humanist vision that Francis shares that brings together all these fields of knowledge, invites us to look at how our own relationships spread across the world, and that what we do identifies ourselves with every creature, this whole family that Pope Francis drew his inspiration from St. Francis, calling all creatures in the earth brothers and sisters. He writes, creating a world in need of development, God in some way sought to limit himself in such a way that many of the things we think of as evil, dangers, or sources of suffering are in reality part of the pains of childbirth, which he uses to draw us into the act of cooperation with the Creator. So we're called to share in God's creativity as we bring this new world forward, this new revolution. And I like to close with this word of praise and thanks and hope from the prophet Jeremiah, who says, there shall yet be heard the song of joy, the song of gladness, the song of the bridegroom, the song of the bride, the song of those bringing thank offerings to the house of the Lord. Give thanks to the Lord of hosts, for the Lord is good. God's love endures forever. So, thank you.
Thank you for helping us think about Laudato Si as an invitation to an energy ethic. We now have time for questions and comments.
Not too long ago, I sold a house and moved to an apartment complex, which is, everything is all set up already. And a lot of these kinds of modifications I would be unable to do. Mm-hmm. So what suggestions might you have about that, Dawn?
Well, that's a great point, because many of us live different kinds of lives, and what might be possible for one person is not possible for another. One might be able to ride a bicycle or take public transportation, and one really cannot get to work without a car and a fairly long distance, and that's a fact. If you're at a place where you can make choices, you can alter some of those things, but many of us cannot. I think it's an exciting opportunity for young people. They have many of these decisions ahead of them, and they can choose the sorts of communities they live in. They can choose a lot of their lifestyle patterns. But our carbon footprint is made up of so many different things that there are many things you could do. You could you could request renewable energy in your utility bill. That's certainly one thing you could do. You can look at your eating habits, buying local, eating lower on the food chain, eating more vegetarian. You can shift, it's sort of that Lenten model of time, talent, and treasure. You can give some of your time to working in a community to increase sustainable options for the whole community, even if you personally may not be able to change something in your home And there, you're working at a higher scale. So there may be a ripple effect through many people that you're able to do. So I think it's useful to look at the many things we can do, and it also frees us, I think, from that sense of judgment that, well, if you don't ride a bicycle, you're just not an environmentalist. You know, sometimes that doesn't work for everybody, but that doesn't excuse us from looking hard at all the things that we do that has an impact.
I have 3 questions. First question is, do you realize that you're preaching to the choir here tonight?
Well, amen.
Second question is, why are devout Catholics resisting what you said here tonight? Most of them are my Republican friends. And 3, how many homilies have you heard on this subject?
Excellent question. Those are all really good questions. Well, the sociological reality is that people's environmental worldviews align most strongly with their political worldviews. And those groups that you mentioned tend to resist regulation, resist what they perceive as government infringement on freedom, which regulation can be part of that, emphasize small business, et cetera. So that is just the association of political affiliation with environmental attitudes. However, even Catholic Republicans are more environmentally conscious than non-Catholic Republicans. So there is a Catholic effect, even among Republicans. To your point about hearing preaching on it, this is a really important issue. I think we have to recognize a couple things. I mean, the climate science problem is relatively new. A lot of the people in the audience may have studied it in high school, but most of our priests and bishops did not, for sure. They did not hear about it in seminary. Laudato Si was not a part of their theological education. I doubt they read that 1981 bishop's letter because no one has read that. So this comes down to the scientific literacy question. If you don't know it's a problem, you can't talk about it. And if it hasn't been clearly stated as a moral issue and freed from this polarizing frame of politics, then it's very difficult to talk about it. Even with the consistent teaching in Catholic social teaching, it hasn't been brought forth as something for priests to talk about. There's also often a perception that this is a task for the laity, and it is indeed a task for the laity, and Vatican II calls us to bring holiness into the world, but we also need that moral leadership from our priests, and people listen more to their local priests than many others. I think one of the freedoms we have as Catholics is not only do we have the example of Laudato Si, but unlike some of the Protestant ministers I spoke with, there isn't a job security issue as much with Catholic priests. I did hear from Protestant seminary, Protestant ministers that if they talked about this and alienated some of their congregation, they might lose their job. So we can be proud of that kind of freedom in our community to preach what needs to be preached.
Do you have any specific ideas on how to overcome this, what you call the action gap, especially where people feel too busy or overwhelmed?
This is why I like this notion of a spirituality of creative sacrifice, right? All of us have 24 hours in a day, 7 days in a week. We are finite, no matter what. We can only do so much. We cannot take on more unless we take something out. So it's necessary to take a prayerful, realistic, discerning look at the things that are occupying our time and our attention and seeing if there's something that we could take away. You know, sort of the closet clutter cleaning of our lives in order to make space for something that with reflection we realize is actually really important to our our sense of ourselves as Christians, our sense of ourselves as perhaps parents, or as brothers and sisters of those around the world suffering? What is it about our own identity, our own values, that's calling us to say, I can't really be myself unless I spend some time resolving some problem, giving time to some new action? And I think we need to be realistic and say, we're finite. What can I take out so that I can do something that with thought I realize is more important?
I am very aware of the carbon, what do I want to say there? Taking away the carbon, but I guess something I heard on the radio the other day just puts a face on the people who in turn will lose jobs because of the carbon, the coal and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, how do you deal with that aspect of it within yourself, actually? And I mean, that really is a problem. People are going to lose jobs because which I certainly support, going toward the carbon neutral kind of thing. But that was a piece that I hadn't really hit me before.
Right, and I think this is a really important part of a Catholic energy ethic, that not only are we concerned about increasing energy access to the poor, but also increasing the capacity for access to renewable energy for those in low-income situations, and that takes all sorts of creative and necessary policy adjustments. But we also have to be pastorally concerned about the worker, and that's really where modern Catholic social teaching began, is in concern for the worker. So we have to take that in. And I feel, and this was discussed at one of the many conversations earlier today, that it would be wonderful to see the bishops of the coal mining regions really convene conversations and invite in industry leaders and think about, how are we going to transform the economy of this region? Because coal is over, really, in the United States. 80% of the coal jobs are already gone, right? The solar industry is producing far, far more jobs. Now, that doesn't mean you can have solar jobs in West Virginia, but they need to prioritize, as a pastoral obligation, I think, finding ways to create new conversations and bring new stakeholders in. So that's a very important point.
In his encyclical, Pope Francis talks about our obligation to future generations. Could you talk about that a little?
Sure. This is one of these sort of new ethical categories of intergenerational justice. We're expanding that model of kinship, not only among our brothers and sisters around the whole world, but to our brothers and sisters in all the living communities, brother frog, sister water. That's the power of the Franciscan canticle. So some scholars have called this a thickened humanism. Our humanism is thicker because we realize that our health as people depends on the health of the ecosystem. So we have this thicker kinship, and we also, that's in space, we also have a thicker kinship through time. And intergenerational justice is essential. We cannot, it's unacceptable to live in a state of ecological debt towards our neighbors in the global south, and it's also not good to be in a state of debt towards the future generations and take from them the conditions needed for the flourishing common good. So yes, intergenerational justice is kind of a newer term in ethics.
Hi. We have a fair number of students here this evening, yay for extra credit. A lot of our students are heading out into tough job environments, and what advice might you have for a student who is maybe just getting into their first full-time job, or being the new person in their job setting? What does it mean for someone to integrate this professionally and vocationally into their work life?
Okay. I have actually the graduate assistant who helped me with so much of my research for Inspired Sustainability is currently, now not everyone's going to go into an environmental field, right? You might go into anything. She does responsible data assessment. So looking at, if someone is looking at deforestation and taking helicopter images, how do we know we're using that data responsibly? Are there pictures of people in that image? Or if we're comparing data from different medical outreach teams, is the data consistently assessed and so on? But she works 100% from home. She's moving from Boston to Grand Rapids. She does not have an office. She is 100% a virtual office. And millennials are trending in this direction. And I would say, float it as part of your job interview. What are your policies for telecommuting? What is the requirement for in-office presence? That's a huge way to counter your commute, save money, increase job satisfaction. I'm not saying 100% because it's really nice to have wonderful colleagues, right? But 1 day a week, it's a huge boost to productivity. It's a boost to family life. There's actually a study that links the length of your commute to divorce rates, to sickness rates. This is what Pope Francis is talking about fighting rapidification, right? Are there ways we can slow down? And one of my favorite reports from a British Sustainability Council, I can't, blanking on the name of the report right now. Prosperity without growth, right? There's been an assumption that prosperity and growth go together. Not only is that not necessarily true, but this year is the first year that economies globally have grown without a correlated growth in emissions. So we're seeing the separation of economic growth and fossil fuel emissions. This is huge. This is exactly what we need. And this report talks about the 4-day work week as a great solution. We all know people who say are lawyers or management consultants who are doing the work of 2 people. Now, for those people who are out of work and think it might be fair if that job was cut in half and they each had a normal work life, that might be a good thing. And if, who knows, is the 4-day work week a solution? I don't know, but why not 1 day where you can telecommute? Maybe you can think about where you live, et cetera, look for the walkable community. So there are things that I think can be brought in the discussion, and I think millennials are looking for these choices.
I have a question regarding the basis of the Pope's encyclical, chapter 2, where he talks about the religious background. Yet he starts out his encyclical by saying he's speaking to all peoples of the world, yet this chapter 2 is addressed, as I can see it, to Judeo-Christians. Is there anybody in the non-Judeo-Christian world that's writing and talking in the same language as Pope Francis? Because I can see other people saying, well, he's really addressing this to Catholics because his footnotes are to a lot of the Catholic catechism and so forth. So is somebody else addressing that issue?
Yes, I don't think any one of his global visibility. There are few more visible moral bully pulpits than the papacy, which is one reason this encyclical has been so influential, and that's magnified tremendously by the personality of this particular pope that makes him not only such a prominent authority, but also an authority that people really want to listen to and find easy to listen to. That said, yes, there are faith-based environmentalists from every single tradition working on this issue, writing on this issue. Thich Nhat Hanh is a Buddhist leader. There are multiple Jewish groups. I would say the most prominent is indeed from the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Patriarch Bartholomew, who's cited at the beginning of the encyclical. But this is a global group. I think one of the touch points in the modern faith-based environmental history was in 1986 when there was a conference at Assisi, and Pope John Paul was there. It was hosted by the World Wildlife Federation, and there were leaders from every religious tradition there. There were indigenous people in their fabulous costumes. There was Pope Francis. There were people from all faith traditions. So there are commitments from every leader, and these were present at Paris. They were present at Copenhagen, even though that had less success. There was a very large conference of religious leaders, all of whom developed 7-year sustainability plans, global 7-year sustainability plans for their global communions, and these were shared before the Copenhagen Convention. And Ban Ki-moon went there, and he said, well, this is what gives me hope, the religious communities of the world, because they are inspiring people. They are calling on their own deepest faiths and beliefs and motivations. Unfortunately, and he was right to say that the political leaders didn't deliver as much at that time. And I think that Pope Francis was aware of this and put forth his document at a time when it could influence the political conversations and have a voice in time for the Paris Climate Treaty talks. So yes, and if you go to the website of the Forum on Religion and Ecology, you can see statements from every tradition going back years. We may be wrapping this up. I'm grateful for your listening presence, for your interest. If you're all members of the choir, please, as St. Francis says, let us sing as we go. So sing loudly, talk about this revolution. Thank you.